Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's episode in our Facebook Live series. I'm your host, historian Edna Friedberg. Today is World Photography Day, and if you've ever visited our museum here in Washington, you will no doubt remember being enveloped by a soaring three-story tower of photographs, more than 1,000 of them in total, that tell the story of life before the war in a single town. There are snowy days, school pictures, birthdays, and every important milestone in the life of this close-knit community. But after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union 80 years ago, in June 1941, these ordinary pleasures abruptly ended in Aishishak, also called Eišiškės, in what is today Lithuania. In September 1941, killers came to the doorsteps of the villagers pictured here, rounding up the Jewish townspeople. Over just 2 days, the Germans and their collaborators murdered men, women, and children at the distance of the barrel of a rifle, a Holocaust by bullets. A vibrant Jewish community that had lasted for hundreds of years was wiped out in a sudden burst of violence. Our guest today to discuss this unique collection is Judith Cohen, former Chief Acquisitions Curator here at the Holocaust Museum. Good morning, Judy. It's so good to see you.
Good morning.
Judy cataloged many of the photographs that you just saw in this clip and knows some of the personal stories behind them. And Judy, I know you are an ideal guest to have on the show today to talk about the power of photography beyond this collection to help us better understand the people behind this difficult history and what was truly lost. During today's show, please send your questions for Judy by posting them in the comments section, and we'll get to as many of them live as we have time for. Now, Judy, let's help our viewers to understand. We have these extraordinary photos of the town of Aishishak because of the decade-long effort of a single woman, a Holocaust survivor from that town who wanted to reassemble some of the memories from her destroyed childhood. Who was Yafa Eliach, the driving force behind this collection?
Yafa Eliach was, as you said, a child survivor. Here we see her really on the cusp of the invasion, just days before the invasion. She's about 5 or 6. And she has 3 roles that all came together for her desire to build this collection. One, as you said, she's a child survivor. She and her immediate family were some of the only survivors of Aishishak. Most of her extended family was killed, as was the majority of the town. Second of all, she was the granddaughter of the town's photographer. So many of the photos in the tower were taken by her grandmother. So she feels a very personal connection to these photos. It's a family collection. And third, she's a Jewish historian. She'd been a professor of Jewish history at Brooklyn College. So she's looking at these photographs and at the lens of her community as a young child who survived unspeakable horrors, as the descendant of the photographer, and as a Jewish historian.
And we don't only have to talk about Yafa Eliach, whose maiden name was Zonenson. We can hear from her directly. We have a clip of Yafa describing a sort of light bulb moment that she had in the days when our museum was being planned and envisioned. She was inspired to create what she called a tower of life. Let's watch.
And I felt that my colleagues were constantly speaking about death and destruction, that they would like the museum in Washington to represent the Holocaust. And I felt that I would like the museum in Washington also to represent Jewish life and to present life before death and to give to the victims back their identity, their culture, their dynamics as human, creative people, as members of humanity. My question was, how can I do it? And I was thinking I would like to represent the people in a different way. And as the plane was flying from Warsaw to Kiev, I realized that somewhere below the clouds is my little town. And it is then on the plane that I made my decision to document, actually to use Aishishak as a model of normal life, of life before death.
So Judy, can you tell us a bit about this little town that Yafa wanted us to remember in its fullness, not just for how it ended?
So Aishashok was what is called a shtetl, a very small town. In fact, I was really shocked when I was researching the town several years ago to discover that it had only about 3,000 people. It was smaller than my high school. So a very small community, but despite the numbers, it was a very vibrant community. And that comes out through the photographs that we'll discuss later. Lots of different political parties, lots of different types of cultural activities, educational activities. And you'll see this reflected in the range of activities. And based on what Yafa said, one thing that's interesting is that people have a misconception of what a shtetl is. It's often reduced to stereotypes, either to kitsch or is sort of an unknown. And for her, it was very important that people learn not only the term, but what exactly it was, how it was a town on the cusp of modernity, what was going on. And we have all these photographs that show the vibrancy of the town, the sporting activities, the cultural activities, the religious activities.
And Yafa herself had many fond memories. What are we looking at here?
So here we see Yafa, her older brother Yitzchak, and her parents Moshe and Tzipora walking in the snow. Yafa is bundled up. She looks like probably about 3 years old, 2 years old. A very warm community. It was a town where people knew each other, and they're walking down the street. And here's another photograph of her family shortly before the invasion. Again, she's there with her parents and her older brother. And you again have a sense of what was there before the start of the war.
And I'm struck there looking at it as a mother myself. I know you're a mom and a grandma, seeing, that's a family dressed up for a picture, someone who took a lot of care that her kids look pressed and crisp and nice for a family portrait. I want to pause for a moment to welcome our viewers who are watching from all around the United States. Good morning, and thank you for joining us from Tullahoma, Tennessee, from Dallas and Texas. We also have people watching from Oxford, Mississippi, Canton, Texas, Lexington, Kentucky, and Albany, New York. And also a welcome to our international viewers, whatever the time of day is there, in Sydney, Australia, in Manila, in the Philippines, watching from Poland, Peru, and Brazil. We're very glad to have you with us. So Judy, you had mentioned that this is a predominantly Jewish town. I think it was around 70% Jewish. Tell us a little bit about the pre-war dynamics in Aishashok. How, in what ways would Jews and Christians have interacted with each other?
Okay, so, as we said, the town itself was predominantly Jewish. A lot of the town's activities centered around the synagogue. So that would have been an exclusively Jewish activity. And here we see one of the Hebrew schools. However, the surrounding community was predominantly Polish and Lithuanian, and there was a lot of interaction, a lot of economic interdependence between the two communities. And even when you get talking about education, there was a Polish high school that both Poles and Jews attended. There was some socializing. A lot of Poles worked in Jewish establishments. A lot of them were nannies. On market day, the two communities came together. There were underlying tensions, but it was a community that was really interdependent between the Polish and the Jewish community, and really fairly tightly knit in that sense between the two communities.
And just for context or background for people who may not know much about the history of Jews or of Eastern Europe, a big part of the reason that Jews would have been predominantly storekeepers and their neighbors more agricultural or farmers had to do with centuries-long prohibitions prohibiting Jews from owning land. And so these roles kind of became cemented in place as a result of older restrictions. But it was symbiotic, as you described. People needed each other and worked together and were used to each other. Judy, many of the photographs that we have in this very powerful exhibition, this 3-story tower, which we saw earlier, came from a single photography studio in Aishashok. Could you tell us about its owner, who happened to be Yafa's grandmother, a woman named Alta Katz?
Okay, so Alta Katz was And here we see her portrait, a really lovely portrait. And you can see the town's name is written on the side of the portrait. Owned a photo studio. It was actually started by her husband. She was a widow. And I point that out because it tells you something else about the sociology of the town. Her husband had immigrated to the United States temporarily early on, beginning of the century. And he thought that maybe the family should move. He went to test the waters, so to speak, and decided no, he preferred Aishashoq. So he came back. But he also said, well, if I'm coming back, I want to find a better way to make a living and raise money. And photographic equipment was more readily available in the United States. So he brought a camera and film and everything you needed to establish a photo studio back with him in Aishashoq. And he established this photo studio. And then after he passed, his wife, Alta, became the town's photographer. She was one of two photographers in town, but the only one to have a photo studio. The photo studio was located inside a pharmacy. Sounds like a strange combination, but that's where it was. And here's a picture of the pharmacy. I adore this photo because you see all the posters, and if you look at it carefully, you get a sense of all the activity that's going on in this one store. And there was a bakery on the lower level, there was a photography on the main level, and there was the photo studio on the top level. And Alta Katz was running all three establishments.
So really kind of a one-stop shop. You might pick up some bread, some medicine, make an appointment to have your children photographed. Let's have a look at a few of these pictures to give a sense of what they were creating.
Here's a photograph of two sisters, and I point to it because you can see the very stylized border. In the United States, we're not quite sure what the term photo studio means. We don't use photo studios anymore, but it was more than just snapping a picture with a camera. You also found a very artistic way to then display it. So here's an example of the artwork that was created in the studio. And then if we go on to the next photo, we can see something else that was done. This is real kitsch, and it's very funny. It is Yafa is again bundled up. We saw her in the same coat earlier, and there she is with her mother and her brother and a cousin in behind a cardboard automobile. So it's sort of this fake automobile. We have pictures and all sorts of interesting sceneries of sort of superimposing the actual photo, which here is her family, against this artistic creation of the car and the background. Again, was a very common type of photography before the war.
Look, and I'll confess, I'm, a middle-aged person. I'm old enough that my high school graduation portraits were taken in a studio with, professional lighting and backdrops. It was something that people didn't have access to. And I think it's important for us to remind ourselves, no one or almost no one would have had their own personal camera then. They really relied on professional photographers to take their pictures. And with so many of us now having smartphones, we have to remember that taking photographs was expensive, not access. And what we're really seeing in these pictures are sort of a highlights reel, similar to what people might post on social media today. We couldn't just grab photos, right? I know this is something you try to impress on young people.
Yeah, so when I talk to high school students, because again, you're used to snap, 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 snap. People go snapping the whole way through, and without a lot of thought necessarily in what you're taking the picture of, and then you sort it out later and you delete 90% of the pictures and then you keep the ones you want. But I say, suppose you're going somewhere and you have only 1% of your battery left. What do you take pictures of? And that's the analogy. Film was expensive, going to a photo studio was expensive, but you think very deliberately about what it is that you want to capture. And that's one of the things that we'll see later on that's interesting, is it's not only portraits, but major life cycle events, schools, even photographs of economic activity. But there was a lot of thought put into what you were going to take a photograph of and what you were going to preserve as a photograph.
Now, to get back to the town of Aishashoq, what we're getting this window into, its physical location really shaped what happened to it. It was at the crossroads of many cultures, and it was a borderland, really, right on the edge of Poland, of Lithuania, of what is now Belarus. How did things change for the Jews of Aishashok after the start of World War II?
The fact that it was a borderland is of huge importance because the government kept changing. It was a contested land, and it had been ruled by Poland, by Lithuania, by the Soviet Union, and by Germany. As we said before, the Jewish community and the surrounding non-Jewish community was very tightly integrated. With the rise of Nazism already in the 30s, the anti-Semitic, the anti-Jewish current started becoming more dominant. But things didn't really change in a major way until the Soviet occupation of Aishashok in 1940, after the Soviet Union and Germany had divided up Poland. And then for years, they left Lithuania independent. Then the Soviet Union annexed Lithuania. And this led to huge sacrifice for the Jewish community. The Jewish schools were outlawed because they didn't approve of the Hebrew culture. A lot of people were deported to Siberia. So there was, and businesses, including Alta's photo studio, were nationalized. But at the same time, the communist commissar was Jewish, and that led to a lot of anti-Jewish feelings of people saying, look, we're suffering on account of communists and Jews. So it led to a huge increase in the tension between the communities. Then, almost exactly to the day after the Soviets annexed, Germany invaded Lithuania and Aishashok in June of 1941. And then, to quote some survivors, the community went from the frying pan into the fire. Immediately afterwards, Jews were subjected to a number of anti-Jewish restrictions by the Germans, had to wear a yellow star, were subject to forced labor, had to turn in their valuables. At one point, in a very personal way, Yafa's family suffered immediately when her father, in a way of just sort of sadistic glee of the Germans, was told to put a fire hose from actually the firefighting equipment on his own brother on top of a roof, which really endangered his life. And if he didn't do that, he was going to be whipped. So there was this humiliation, sadism, and all of this was building up over the summer of 1941.
And in this atmosphere of terror, Yafa's father, Moshe, decided he wanted to go into hiding. Did he not?
Right. So Moshe wanted to go into hiding. He wanted his family, obviously, to come with him. His wife was reluctant to leave her mother. And Alta didn't want to go into hiding. And I think there's a very important point that needs to be stressed is that often people say, well, didn't they see it coming? And the fact is, nobody had a crystal ball to see what was going to happen. They only knew what had happened so far, and a feeling that if this is as bad as it can get, we can live through it. His mother had remembered, grandmother Alta, the German occupation during World War I, where it was fairly benign, and there was a view that we can sit it out. And so in these early months, the family didn't go into hiding. They did a bit later, and we're going to talk about that.
But in such a tense and confusing time, it would have been really difficult to know what's the right thing to do, what's the safest thing to do. Moshe Zanenson, Yafa's father, was not the only person who was increasingly afraid about the danger to him, to his family, to his community. Tell us about a local leader named Rabbi Shimon Rozovsky.
Rabbi Shimon Rozovsky was the chief rabbi of the town. And here we have another beautiful portrait of him. And despite the long beard and the traditional garb, he was a fairly modern man. He was involved in political parties, and more importantly, was very involved in refugee assistance. And in the 1930s, starting from 1939, after the German invasion of Poland, a lot of Polish Jews fled to Lithuania, and came to Ishashok, and he was doing refugee relief. So he knew exactly what was going on in Poland and begged his community to go into hiding. And this is extraordinary for an Orthodox rabbi. He begged them to try to find arms to fight back. He thought he saw what was coming, and some people believed him, and most of them didn't. They said, it's not going to happen to us.
But tragically, it did happen to them. Could you please walk us through the horrible events of September 1941 in Ishashok?
In September 1941, exactly 3 months after the invasion, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, which is one of the high holidays, one of the holiest days in the Jewish calendar, the Germans told the Jews to gather in the synagogue. And some people said, oh, look, they're giving us permission to pray. Isn't that nice? And a couple others, including Yafa's father, said they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. This spells danger. The Jews who were gathered in the synagogue were kept there without food and water for a couple days and then taken to the marketplace. From the marketplace, first men were marched out to the Jewish cemetery. The following day, women and children were marched out to the Christian cemetery. And you had talked about the Holocaust by bullets. This is what happened. They were shot into mass graves by Germans and Lithuanian collaborators. And in the space of 2 days, almost the entire population of Ishashok had been killed.
Thousands of people. And Rabbi Rozovsky, who we were just talking about, who was trying to protect his flock, what was his fate?
So Rabbi Rozovsky was the last of the men to be killed, and was an extra bit of sadistic pleasure probably for the Germans, is that they made him witness all of his community being killed. And they set him aside to be the last one to be murdered. The situation, how he was killed, is a little up to dispute. Some survivor testimonies say that he was the last one shot. Others say that he was just put into a mass grave and buried alive. We don't know which is the right story.
What is known, though, without doubt, is that families had been torn apart, that men were separated from women, from children and babies. And the next day, the women and children of Ishashok were taken to the Catholic cemetery, where they suffered the same brutal fate. We have direct eyewitness testimony from a rare survivor from Ishashok, a man named Leon Kahn. At the time of the massacre, Leon was a teenager. He and his brother had fled and hidden for several days and were actually, just by chance, hiding in the Catholic cemetery when wagon loads of women and kids were brought in to be shot. Children, babies. In his testimony, and we will post a link in the comments later if you'd like to watch his full testimony, Leon describes watching as women, people he'd known, his aunts, his teachers, were forced to undress and being shot. He witnessed things no one should have to see, including the gang rape and murder of his own cousin, a teenage girl. And years later, looking back, Leon reflected about how the memories of that day continued to haunt him. Let's have a listen to Leon Kahn.
The scene comes back to me over and over and over again. The scream of the people, the shouting of the people, the shooting, and the children, being a father myself and being a grandfather myself, tearing the children away from their mothers, I kept screaming to my brother, do they know what they are doing? Those are human beings that they are killing. Do they know what they're doing? My brother kept saying, don't look, don't look, don't look. And that was the end of Ishashok.
It's really viscerally painful to listen to Leon, and it was very brave of him to revisit these memories for us, just how brutal the nature was of these massacres. But we also need to remember that this is a scene that is repeated in town after town in well over 1,000 places over the course of 1941 and 1942. And we are seeing here a picture of one such massacre, this time in Ukraine. It happened again and again. People often envision the Holocaust as solely unfolding in kind of specially designed, almost clinical settings, concentration camps and gas chambers, things that happen in out-of-the-way places and that were in some way cloaked. But in towns like Aishashak and across occupied Soviet territory, Jews were murdered in broad daylight, often in sight or in earshot of their Christian friends and neighbors. And in many places, locals even joined in as collaborators, either directly participating in the killing, as in Aishashak, or helping the murder squads in kind of more mundane ways. Someone had to do their laundry. Someone had to cook their meals. We have a comment from a viewer named Susan. She writes that the last letter that her grandmother received from her family said they were urgently trying to feed and clothe starving Polish Jewish refugees, and that they hoped that the Nazis wouldn't invade. And later they learned that days after this letter was sent, their relatives had been massacred in the forests near their town. So this is disturbingly not at all an unusual story. Judy, we have an audience question from a woman named Peggy. She asked, how were Yafa and her family able to escape when so many others were not?
So, as I said, the father told the children, don't go into the synagogue. And the father and Yafa and her older brother Yitzhak independently fled, and the father had given them the name of a Polish friend of theirs, and they went there. At first, they thought their mother and she had a baby brother, that they had been taken, but they were later able to escape. And the whole family reunited in a town a little outside of Aishashak, a larger town called Radon. And in Radon, there was a ghetto. Not everyone in Radon had been killed, and they were living there. Life in the ghetto wasn't pleasant. There wasn't, that much food. There was forced labor for the adults, but they were able for a very short period of time to have some normalcy. The situation in Radon got increasingly more difficult, and the family decided they needed to go into hiding. And they hid with a couple different Polish farmers whom they knew ahead of time before the war. And Yafa, in a lecture that I heard her give many years ago, talks very pointedly about the fact that anyone who survived from there did so because somebody else, often not Jewish, usually not Jewish, took enormous risk to their own life to hide them. And that was the case with them. But hiding isn't a simple thing. First of all, the rescuer could have been shot if found out. And they had to switch hiding places on numerous occasions as it became too difficult to stay in one place and too dangerous. And for a large part of the war, they actually hid in a cave below a pigsty in darkness. Incredible. I mean, I can't imagine living in darkness under a pigsty for one day, let alone for months upon months. But that's where they spent a good part of the war. But one thing that's extraordinary about Yafa's parents is that they did what they could to give Yafa and her brother some semblance of a normal childhood. Here's Yafa and brother again before the war. There's nothing normal about knowing that your extended family had been killed or living in a pigsty, but her mother taught her how to read in this pigsty by having her carve out Hebrew letters in the walls. So even within this horrific situation, the parents were there to protect their kids and say, how can we continue their education and do something to keep them occupied and educated for so they would be ready when the war ended to resume life.
But even while in hiding, they still suffered a lot of loss. I want to mention in particular, one of the Polish women who had helped them was actually discovered to be hiding Jews and was killed. She paid with her life for it. There's a particularly horrible incident where Yafa's family is in hiding with some other Jews, and the infant brother that you mentioned earlier was crying. He was making noise as babies do. And in the course of trying to muffle him and keep him quiet, some of the others in hiding actually suffocated him. So their little baby was killed, died in order to try to keep them safe. Yafa's mother also, and it's impossible to imagine what this was like for her, actually became pregnant again, right, Judy, and gave birth to another baby boy while they were on the run. What happened?
While in hiding, very shortly before the war ended, the mother gave birth to another little boy. It wouldn't have been safe to keep him there, but they got the boy, the infant, this newborn, transferred to a Catholic convent, and with the explanation that it was a child who was born out of wedlock. And these nuns protected the little boy for the remaining part of the war. And the family was able to retrieve the child after liberation and bring him back to Aishashak with them.
And Judy, looking at these very sweet pictures of, Yafa as a adorable little girl with her brother, we've heard from several people responding to these photographs. A woman named Kim writes, "As I look at the photograph of this beautiful little girl, the word massacre is incomprehensible to me. Who could possibly hurt a child this young and this innocent? But we know that it happened to so many innocent children." And indeed, Kim, more than 1 million, it's an incomprehensible number, more than 1 million Jewish children were murdered during the Holocaust for the crime of just being born as a Jewish boy or girl. Judy, when after so much peril, so much trauma and loss, Yafa's nuclear family did eventually return to liberated Aishashak, what did they find there?
So after the Soviets liberated the area, her parents, her brother, returned to Aishashak, and together with a handful of other families, between 30 or 40 Jews returned to Aishashak. Most had lived there before the war. Some of them were actually from other surrounding towns, and they came back together. It's important at this point to put out the statistic that about 95% of Lithuanian Jews were killed during the Holocaust. It's one of the highest numbers of any country. Almost the entire population had been wiped out, but a couple families returned, and they came and established some sort of home within two what they thought were safe houses. There were two different houses where all the returning Jews were living, but tragically and horribly, the suffering didn't end even with the return to Aishashak.
Yes, and there was a dispute. There were continuing skirmishes between Polish nationalists, Soviets, and Soviet sympathizers. And in fact, devastatingly, after surviving so much, Yafa's mother and the new baby brother were actually shot and killed during an attack by Polish nationalists. Yafa's father was arrested and sent for forced labor in the interior of the Soviet Union. And Yafa, a young girl, still, elementary school age, with the help of an uncle, was able to leave and immigrate to the British Mandate of Palestine in April 1946. And for a time, understandably, Yafa left Aishashak behind. It's hard to imagine that anyone would have the resilience to go on after what she had witnessed, but she started a new chapter. Tell us very briefly, what was Yafa's life like, and how did she make her way back to telling the story of her hometown?
So Yafa said to Palestine, later Israel, went to school there, had a very inspiring teacher by the name of David Eliach, who later, by coincidence, she ended up marrying. They later moved to the United States. She became a professor of Jewish studies, of history that we mentioned. And in that capacity, she was invited to be part of the presidential commission that established the Holocaust Museum. But the whole time she kept thinking of memory, and she was deeply troubled already from when she was a teenager, that not only didn't people know what a shtetl was, they didn't have a conception of who were these people who were killed, and was very troubled that people talk about 6 million as an abstraction, but none of us, despite our best efforts, can visualize what do 6 million look like. And she felt that you couldn't understand the Holocaust without seeing the faces of the victims. And this became her commitment, her life work to try to put a face to those who had been killed.
So in practical terms, how did she do this? How did she track down all of these photographs, more than 1,000 in total, from a destroyed world?
So back when we were talking about the pharmacy and the photo studio, we said there was a lot of immigration and emigration. It was a community in flux. And a lot of people from Aishashok had come to the United States, including, by coincidence, the parents of a well-known actor who a lot of you may know of, Ed Asner from Mary Tyler Moore's Elf. His families had immigrated from Aishashok. And as is the case now, when you are doing something, you always take a picture and we email it to relatives. They mailed it to relatives. And so most of the photographs in the tower had been sent to relatives before the war in the United States, in Israel, in South Africa, in South America, France, literally throughout the world. There are Aishashok survivors, families who had come, and they had collected these photos. And I said she made it her life mission to collect as many photographs as possible to show the entirety of the town. And sometimes she had to cajole, sometimes she had to bribe. One person, she'd get the photographs in exchange for a pair of Reeboks. Another sort of crazy story, somebody said, I'll give you the photos, but I want you to know your mother insulted me when I was a young girl and called me an ugly monkey. So first you apologize on behalf of your mother, and then I'll give you the photos. And hook or crook, she kept going she actually even took out a loan on her life insurance policy to travel the world to collect photos that would document her shtetl.
And let's have a look at a few more of these photos just to show the range.
So here's some, and we'll just talk about them briefly. And I'll just mention that after the show, there'll be a link to the catalog page for those who want to explore the collection in detail and read the captions. This one I love. We talk about globalization as if it's something new, but here we see globalization in the 1930s when Mickey Mouse visited Aishashok. Aishashok wasn't set apart from the rest of the world. It was very much connected, and here in the form of Mickey Mouse. Here's a great picture that our younger viewers can relate to. Two teenagers, communists having a smoke. It wasn't done in a photo studio. It's more intimate. Two slightly rebellious, but the boy actually was a yeshiva student, had a religious education. So you can see the combination, again, of modernity and religion all coming together in the town before the war. This is another fantastic photo. And, we've talked about so many tragic things that it's sort of fun to see these pictures that put a smile on your face. So it was a town on the cusp of modernity. First, automobiles arrived, but there wasn't the infrastructure to support them. So here's a car that got stuck in the mud because the road fell off the road. You can see the road in the background, but wasn't quite there to support the automobiles. But it's trying to move into what was the modern world shortly before the war.
And we'd like to acknowledge that some of Yafa's former students, both from Brooklyn College and from Yeshiva of Flatbush High School, are watching today and saying how moved they were by knowing her. So thank you for writing in. Excuse me. Also, I'm struck knowing that Yafa wasn't just, an outside observer doing this, but she knew some of the relationships of people in the town. How did that affect the way that she curated this collection, Judy?
One thing that's important to know is that she decided where all the photographs were going to go. One of the many, many tragedies that we don't think about is that there are no graves, no marked graves for the people who were murdered. There's no tombstone where people can go. And she saw this as the tombstone for her community. And she wanted people to be placed in a way that they wanted to be. So on one hand, in her oral history, she says, oh, it was a totally idyllic community. On the other hand, she said, and this person wasn't talking to that person, and this person wasn't talking to any person. It was a normal community. And so she made a point of people who didn't really get along, of putting them on opposite sides of the tower, knowing this would be their final resting place.
So she did it with sensitivity and with intimate knowledge. And her pursuit of these photographs, it bordered on an obsession. I read a quote from her saying that her husband reacted. She would show up with a new batch of photos and he'd say, "Don't you think it's enough already?" But she succeeded in providing some kind of visual reconstruction of a place that was shattered and that people tried to erase. Judy, we're almost out of time, but in closing, I want to ask you about photography more generally. As we noted, we are sharing these images on World Photography Day, and photographs have been central to the work that you've done over decades at our museum. In your opinion, what is the power of photos and how do they help us to have a more complete understanding of the Holocaust?
First of all, I'd say probably with the exception of moving images and oral history, nothing is as powerful as seeing an image. It teaches you things not only in an intellectual way, but in a visceral, emotional way. As we said before, it helps you concretize what is it that we mean when we say 6 million were killed. It's not a number that was killed, but it's 6 million individuals with faces and full lives. And we can put a context to that, both an intellectual and an emotional context. And finally, I would say that you have one person's family photos and you say, okay, I can use this to learn about an individual family, memorialize an individual family. And we see these are really artifacts of memory. You can learn a biography of somebody and place it together with a photograph. But when you see them in a totality, you get a sense of the whole community. You might have one photograph of one individual school and you say, okay, I learned that there was a Hebrew school. But then you see another photograph of the Polish school and you say, putting these together, I can learn the different communities. And so no one photograph exists in a vacuum. Putting them together, we really can learn the history not only of individuals, but also of the community.
Well, thank you, Judy. I always enjoy talking to you and learning from you. And the people who are watching this show also feel the power of this collection. A viewer named Stephanie writes that this room, the room of the Aisha Shock photos, is so haunting. You stand there and look at the faces, thinking what could have been. You see families and generations that no longer exist. Similarly, a viewer named Frank writes, of all the things that I saw on my visit to the museum, this is the one that left an unforgettable memory. So we agree. We hope that people will be able to come and see us, but otherwise we'll browse through this multifaceted, multi-perspective view of one place and remember that it represents hundreds and hundreds and thousands of similar such places. I'd like to close with a comment from a woman named Kate, a nurse from New Jersey, who writes that she remembered seeing the faces in the tower, feeling very broken, and that a picture caught her eye and actually made her laugh, of a baby wearing an oversized sweater that might have been knit by her grandmother. And Kate wrote that Bubby, that the granny and the baby will never be forgotten as long as that photo exists. And that is the hope of all of us here at the museum who feel honored to be the caretakers of this memorial. I think of photographs, not just of Aisha Shock, but of all the other places like it, as being part of a funeral. When we plan a memorial for someone we love, we don't fixate on the crime or the disease or the accident that took their life. We talk about who the people were, what they cared about, and how we want to remember them. And similarly, photographs like these surround us, confront us with the humanity of those who were murdered, people not so different from you or me. And it teaches us what was lost and also the potential that was destroyed. So thank you for this conversation today, and we hope that you will join us for our next program on September 14th at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time for a show called Common Threads, Holocaust Survivors Who Built Fashion Careers. During Fashion Week, we will be discussing how the Nazis destroyed many thriving Jewish-owned design and apparel companies, and about how some of their owners were able to reestablish themselves or even build new careers after the trauma and rupture of the Holocaust. So we hope to see you for that program on September 14th. Until then, wherever you're watching from, be safe and well. Bye-bye.